I might just share at the very beginning of our session today, the thought that this is a Kairos conversation, and as such, there's an opportunity in this for us not just to hear some information, but to really tune in to what the Spirit might be saying to us personally out of this, what God might want us to focus on, to attend to as a Kairos that might impact our lives and bring transformation for us personally, first and foremost, and then perhaps for our community context as well, that flows out from our own personal change. So what might God be saying to us, and what might we go on and do about that, is, the frame really that we're hoping to set up through these conversations for all of us. So if there's something you can take away with you as a key revelation and insight, a breakthrough, then, I'd just encourage you to spend time with that even over the coming week. So we might note that as we go. But otherwise, Bree, terrific to have you on the call as one of our executive team members for Catalyse Change, and bringing a wealth of experience as well into this particular topic on how to lead through change. So over to you.
Yeah, so we're talking today around really leading change, and actually how do we lead change in the particular environment that we're in. My background is I have a particular heart for leading change in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of places. It's something that started with me quite young in high school as I tried to lead significant change through my Catholic girls' high school, which didn't bode well. But was a good experience. And so this is something that I'm particularly passionate about, have been passionate about for a while. It's also the subject of, in some ways, a Masters of Missional Leadership research paper that I did a couple of years ago. So I'll share a bit on that. But you're more than welcome if you want stuff that I've got, if you want to read my research paper, just give me a shout out. Everything I've got is somebody else's most of the time, so I'm happy to pass on their work to you as much as I was to engage it myself. Now, my hope was we might be able to start with a few kind of reflections and just conversations just about where we're at, because I think it's helpful before we get too far to actually open up and have some conversation, particularly on the easy things, before we actually talk about some of the harder things. So I was wondering, welcome to take yourself off mute. What's your best experience of change? Can you give us a couple of sentence summary? What might be the best experience you've ever had of a kind of change process? Tough question to start, isn't it?
Well, it's so much easier to recall the ones that haven't worked.
That's my next question, but I was forcing us to start with the positive, Colin.
Hey, well, I guess the change process, I guess, that I've been part of, that I enjoyed being part of, was actually planting a church, which was just an ongoing process of many changes, in lots of ways. So and very much a learning experience too, through that journey.
Right. What about others? What's been your best experience of a change process?
Yeah, I'll go.
Thanks, Chris.
I think for me, the best part's probably one that I'm involved in still at the moment. So obviously it's lots of things has been thrown up in the air because of COVID, but just thinking through changing some ministry stuff at church, where programs not the number one focus, but looking at community and relationships and starting to, I guess, trying to start to push into that missional community kind of space.
Yep.
Being part of that, yeah, it's been really encouraging.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Thanks, Chris. One more on the positive before I let you let loose with your stories of disaster. Anyone else who's got a positive experience of change that they think they can reflect on or share?
I think having our fourth child was much more positive than the first. I think we'd sort of worked out how to make an adjustment as a family by then.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when I was thinking about my best experience of change, the first thing that came to mind was changing my kids' schools. It was the best thing we did. It was a great fit. It had a process of transition that was difficult but not hard, and has been the absolutely best thing that we ever did for them. So what have been some of your worst experiences of change? And why? Give us a bit of an understanding as to why they were terrible experiences. No one's willing. Oh, come on. I know some of your stories. What's been the most difficult experience of change that you've seen or you've heard?
I think for me, I'm like, oh, I don't want to share. Bree hears all this stuff all the time. One of the ones that like redefined sort of how I lead or what leadership looks like was shifting roles and changing roles, but still being in the context, but not having any kind of voice or leadership in the old. So I moved from sort of youth ministry into young adults ministry, and balancing how to almost change kind of vocation and not have any say into the other. And I think, like, not that we did it badly, but internally I hadn't changed. And so I was like, I'm still kind of half in youth and I haven't done the right sort of transition change. And I think that's when our role, like what we do and who we are, get clouded.
Yeah.
So I think that's, change in role often looks like an identity shift somewhere, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah. That's a really good example. We could unpack that one a bit further later because it's a really good example of what I'm going to talk about. But thanks for sharing that. Brian, I love yours. Experience of change without communication or consultation. Amen, brother. Absolutely. That's never a good start to change, is it?
So we had a church where we had a vision, and the senior pastor left, and for 2 years, I think I was 21, huge mistake, never do this. 21 years old, they said, hey, we've got no one else, you do it until we find someone. And that was supposed to be like, a few months, and it turned into 2 years. And then the new person came in, and within 3 weeks said, this is the new direction for the church, we're throwing out everything old, we're going, and there was just no consultation, no communication. So when the passion that you have doesn't match the agency you get, there's a pain gap there for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's often when authority and responsibility don't match up as well, when you're given a lot of responsibility, but you don't actually have the authority to throw it through. I think that's a really key learning. That's certainly something I've learnt through pain as well, unfortunately, and probably from a similar chair at a similar age. It's definitely one of the trickier things. So today I thought it would be helpful to flag a whole lot of things and then just open it up for the conversation. So there's a couple of things I want to flag. The first one I think is the difference between change and transition. Now this is basic leadership 101, so I'm not going to spend ages on it. But it is important that we understand the difference between change and transition. And the way I like to see it kind of runs in line with kind of Bridges' book, Transition, Making Sense of Life Changes, which is that transition is that kind of psychological process and the change is the situational process. So transition is really about that kind of inner reorientation and self-redefinition, the kind of stuff Bree was talking about, that you go through alongside of other changes. So change can be as simple as changing the software that you use in your business or in your church. The transition is how people internally adapt to those sorts of things. And so many of you, I'm sure, will know work of guys like Cotter and all those guys who do their leading change and how to lead change. For those who don't, Cotter has a couple of different models, but basically has 8 steps for how to lead change. That's very top down. Certainly in his initial books was a top down process of, create an urgency, set your vision, gather your group of people, empower action, and then kind of build on it and make it stick. His newer book around Accelerate was really talking about leading change as a more agile, networked movement. But basically it used the same principles and processes around creating a sense of urgency and setting people out in different areas. I'm just going to see if I can, I'm not very good at sharing screens. I should probably get somebody to tutor me on this. I can't see what I need. There it is. Okay. Someone, Bree, do you want to school me in how I actually get it to go? Oh, don't go from the beginning.
That one. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. So this is Cotter's 2 change development stuff. This is standard, using it as a background because I actually don't think this is what we can follow in current circumstances. So if we're talking about leading change, both these models, both of his 8 steps, kind of very top-down change, and then his kind of networked Accelerate model, really rely on the fact that we can plan this in advance. And ladies and gentlemen, none of us planned COVID. So I'm not quite sure that's appropriate. So actually what's more appropriate, it tends to be that William Bridges model of transitions. At Catalyse Change, we talk about the 5 V's, about articulating the future, which has a mixture of both. So vision, values, the vehicles, how we evaluate things, and our vocabulary is kind of the way we talk about building change through the Catalyse Change teaching and movement, which is, again, fantastic if you can sit back and take the time to articulate a vision, to set your vehicles, then to build up a culture where you've actually, counting the right things and being careful with your communication. But in our current circumstance, I think this is a little hard for us to actually do because we didn't get to plan this in advance. The situation we're more in, I think, actually sits with William Bridges' kind of transition model. So he talks about moving from the process of transition, and in this he's talking mostly about that inner change or inner transition that goes alongside of change. And he talks about going from uncertainty to skepticism to exploration to commitment, and that process of effectively grieving loss and stepping into what's new. One of the things that I find most helpful is this basic diagram that I use a fair bit to talk about how we go through the process of change. And I think this is helpful for the current situation we're in because we talk about often, you get your status quo, and then as things change, people kind of dive down and it's a negative impact first before it turns. And I think what the situation we've tended to find ourselves in with COVID at the moment is actually that most of our churches who would have been happy to stay in status quo and never move have had to move. So it's like all of our churches and our communities have been pushed into stage 2 in this without ever wanting to go there. So usually that would be something that we would manage. And I think the next one, you try and actually push that up and move that across by limiting the negative consequences and accelerating the pace of change and trying to actually make that dip as low and as small as possible. But we had no warning as churches, as communities, and that's been quite a period that's been quite difficult for people to actually get through that point of managing from starting in that stage of disruption. So we're actually not starting with the vision and the values and leading through that process of change. We're starting in the disruption. And there's a whole range of research about that, but I think it's a helpful thing for us to acknowledge and to realize that we're not starting from that basic tenet that we often talk about when we're talking about leading change or leading transition. We're not starting from the happy place with the vision and values that we're stepping forward into. We're actually starting from that point of disruption and change. And so those reactions of anger and fear, I don't know what they're like in your churches. Maybe your churches are amazing. Our church is full of it. They're getting better. There is movement. And what we're seeing, certainly at GWAC at the moment, is that movement into exploration and acceptance. There is far more positivity. And that's what you look for in this. As you're bringing change, as you're seeking to move things forward, what you're looking for is when people start exploring, when there's signs of acceptance, that's a good sign that you're actually moving forward and you should kind of continue in that trajectory. So one of the key things I've done my research in when it talks about leading change, and certainly in my master's research, I've lost the ability to click forward. Nope, there we go, is around how do we move change in congregations, particularly in resistant congregations. And one of the big areas that I did a lot of work on is how do you actually bring holistic change? So not just changing in terms of changing structures, because anyone who knows, who's done a church plant or has sought to reinvigorate a church, knows that you can change structures pretty quickly and pretty easily. That will often lead to poor psychological transition if you change them quickly and easily, and people usually end up with blood on the carpet and picking up messes. That's certainly part of GWAC's story. But one of the other pieces that I really explored through my research was how do you bring about heart transformation? So I often talk about head, heart, and hands. So you can do your practical change through your cotters. Here's how you go steps forward. You can do your psychological change and transition through the Bridges model. But how do you bring about heart transformation? And so I spent a lot of time working on this. I did a lot of reading with like Pierre Bourdieu and Habitas and all of that sort of stuff. And one of my key findings, and certainly the key finding about how I sought to bring church change in our church, was the value of practices to reinforce new behaviours. So often we talk about, and certainly in our highly academic cultures, like where GWAC is, it's a very academic. Everything is about changing the head first and then the actions will follow. But what Pierre Bourdieu and other researchers have done through the years, and certainly what James K.A. Smith does from a Christian point of view, is he demonstrates that by changing our behaviours, we change our heart. The simplest example, I think, is teaching kids to say ta or thank you when they're like 1 or 2 year old. Almost every parent I know would teach a child to say ta or thank you when they're given something. Now, is that because it gives them, it teaches them the understanding of gratitude? No, they have no idea why they say that word when you give them something, but they learn to say it because it actually builds that heart of gratitude. And we're seeing that rise in practices really coming up. So the book's just gone out of my mind, but they sold out their gratitude journals, Resilience Project. One of the practices that it's doing is really creating a heart of gratitude by asking you to write down at the end of the day 3 things that you're grateful for. And that's an example of how practices can bring about change almost at times by bypassing the mind. And so what I did in my research was I implemented 4 practices in line with 4 missional values in 4 small groups that were resistant to change in our church. So our church had been through probably 5 years of change and moving towards a missional communities model already. And these were small groups that had no interest in joining that at all, none. They had no interest in the missional agenda. They wouldn't have considered themselves missional. Some of them reacted to the use of the word missional, which is, a good learning about language and vocab and all of that sort of stuff. But we saw transformation in those 4 missional values by the implementation of those practices in those small groups, but actually mostly by the call for them to discuss those practices in their small group. And so it wasn't just the practices in themselves, but the practices in the context of community and the way that they actually started to call them out and grow in that in each other. And yeah, one of those groups has gone on to have quite a strong missional heart, which is a fantastic outcome. But really seeking to say, when we're going about change, I think we need to be kind of aiming for head, heart, and hands. And so while the practices is something we can implement, you know, when we get to start a change process, I think they're actually something that we could implement now in our churches in terms of pursuing change in this current season. And a lot of our practices have been disturbed, and that's why people are as disturbed as they can be. But this is what I really wanted to get onto. One of the key things that I think we have to learn to do is adaptive leadership in this time. And particularly, how do we do adaptive leadership for managing change? Now, anyone who's done any work on adaptive leadership, it's huge, it's the big thing. There's plenty of books and people out there about it. But these are the key things that I've taken from my reading on adaptive leadership that I've been trying to really implement over the last little while. For me, the key has been that it's about leading in a more connected way through creativity, meaningful relationships, and as part of a wider system. So often in change processes, we would be the ones saying at the top, here's the vision, here's where we're going, let's all go together. Whereas adaptive leadership is more about problem solving, which suits our current circumstances more so than standard change management practices. So adaptive leadership looks from the balcony to start off with, and it's proactive. It's saying, what are the barriers, what are the issues, what are the problems, and how are we going to address them? How do we need to move? How do we need to pivot? How do we need to change? And so that's where it starts, is by actually climbing out of the balcony, off the ground to the balcony to have a look at what's going on. Now that's something that we've just done as a church, and I think it's really changed the eyes of our team, as we've actually, you know, brought out our mission action plan that we put aside when COVID blew up, because our eyes got so focused on changing all the little things like live stream and how our life group is going to meet and what procedures do we need to put in place within each life group meeting and who can touch what. We got so focused on the detail and the kind of the small things that we lost that view of the balcony about who are we and where are we going. And so adaptive leadership is proactive in that sort of space. It's also intentional. It's a process still. So much like Cotter's process, there is a process to adaptive leadership, but it's more so the process of gathering the right people in the room, identifying the challenges, and actually stepping through them as they arise, rather than a set, here is the start and here is the finish line. I think adaptive leadership is collaborative, and that's certainly key when it comes to trying to solve issues in the current circumstances. This is not anything that we've ever had to look at before, and there's a lot of wisdom that can come from different places, and adaptive leadership really encourages us to hear the different voices. So hear from those in our congregation who might have done some problem solving or some pivoting at work and might have some wisdom to add, not assuming that the leader is the one with all the answers. Adaptive leadership is creative. It has to be, because we're facing problems we haven't seen before. It includes a lot of work regulating emotion. Now, this has been one of the really interesting areas for me, because a lot of adaptive leadership stuff has conversations about the positive nature for stress, and the importance of not necessarily removing that stress, because that is part of what's motivating people to change, but also the leader needing to lead from that kind of typical non-anxious presence place. It also involves a lot of loss and grief, because we're involving change, and change is always a process of loss and grief for someone. It involves risk-taking, it involves permission giving, all of that sort of stuff is not surprising, because you're dealing with a new premise. So how do we actually do this in the current times? How do we lead change? These are kind of the characteristics of, to a degree, what we should be doing. But one of the ladies that I've followed for a little while, who's worked from kind of Harvard Business School, talks about 6 very simple processes. And I think while all of these things are great, we all want to be proactive, intentional, collaborative, risk-taking, permission-giving. These are far more helpful, if I can get them to work, there we go, in how we lead positive change. Now, this is work by Rosabeth Moss-Cantor. You can find some papers by her, but most interestingly, probably some TED Talks and things like that. And she talks about 6 really simple ways that we can lead positive change. And I like them because they all make sense together, but also because they're really simple. And it doesn't matter who we are. And she talks about leading change doesn't necessarily mean you're the leader of the organization. Lots of people lead change from different positions in organizations. And leadership is not just positional, but it's relational as well. And so she talks about leading change using these 6 ideas. The idea that we need to show up and realize that our presence makes a difference. Actually, just being present is really important. That we need to speak up, and that we need to understand that our voices have power, and not just in the words that we say, but in the way we use them to shape the agenda, and even the way we frame the issue for other people. Often the most helpful way we can use our voice in these times is naming and outlining the problem and encouraging others to speak up and bring their voices to the table as well. The third one is to look up to a bigger vision, know what drives you in your organization. I think that's where prior work on vision and values and those sorts of things is really important. And she encourages you to speak about these things and to elevate others' eyes to these, because it brings hope. As we're trying to manage and lead people through a very changing situation, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of difficulty, but helping them to look up to the bigger vision is what will keep hope alive. And so that's a really important thing for us to be doing as we lead. To team up, again, typical adaptive leadership thought, you can't do it alone. Best ventures are where there's a sense of partnership from the beginning. So find partners to help you bring about the change. And not just partners in terms of coaches and, experts in the field who can help you change, but partners in terms of voices in your community and those who are in it together with you and willing to bring about that change. The second last one is never give up, because we're doing adaptive change and managing change in difficult and changing times. We can't predict what the problems will be. We can't predict what the next challenge in the road will be, or the next bump in the road. And so persistence and grit is essential. We might make 3 steps forward and then hit another roadblock. And so she really implores people that persistence and grit is just essential in these times. And finally, we need to lift others up. So when we begin to get traction, when we actually see things moving forward, we need to actually share the successes. So not hold them to ourselves, but the way we lead adaptive change necessarily has that kind of collaborative community space to it. So really encourage to actually share your successes and the tools and whatever you found with whoever you are, but also to share recognition, because that sets up the environment to do it again. As you share, hey, this person came up with this great idea and they brought real wisdom here. That sets up the environment to lead through the next change or challenging situation that we have before us. So they're just a few thoughts. They're a few of the things that I've been trying to work on, not always doing so well, but show up, speak up, look up, team up, never give up, and lift others up, I think are really helpful hooks to hang our hats on in this season. So what are people's reflections, questions? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to kind of gather your thoughts, and then let's open it up for a broader conversation.
I'm still recovering from Steve's story last week. That story of change has really stuck with me, and I'm pretty keen to follow that up one-on-one with you, Steve. I've been sharing a bit of that with my team, and there's some really strong parallels. I've really appreciated Bree's context, and I've done a bit of work on Cotter just recently as well. And I think the top-down versus the collaborative sort of there's different ways to view change, and how do you drive it, who drives it, and even it starts to mess with our positional leadership labels. And I think that I'd love to hear a bit more about how you've facilitated a culture that tries to go beyond positional leadership, particularly because you are in a position to do that. So there's a bit of a paradox there around positional leadership, but you actually do need someone in a position of leadership to facilitate that culture.
And I think that's the key, Rod, is that I was, when I started leading the network of missional communities, and actually I just stepped out of youth ministry, I was a pretty junior staff member at GWAC when basically God gave me a calling to try and move it from a consumer to a missional church. There was a 2IC over my head. There was obviously the vicar over my head. And the only way that I had the freedom to be able to do some of that was with their permission. But with their permission and freedom, then we were able to set up a network of communities that wasn't set up as positional leadership. And if you've done some work on Cotter, then what we did by accident and before Accelerate came out was his model that he talks about in Accelerate, in terms of the hierarchical church model kept running, and our senior leader and the 2IC at that stage really kept that running. And I was given the freedom to go and manage this sort of agile network of communities that were a bit leaderless or far more collaborative. But there's a lot of challenges and clashes as you try and run that dual systems, some of which Cotter points out, some of which Cotter has no idea about. It's just our experience has been very, very, very different to some of what his was. But there's some good parts in holding those two together.
Just to link back, would Steve say that there was a dual system going when you were instituting some change? Because I can see that's a theme, and without blowing the whole thing apart, particularly for organised church that wants to move from programmatic to relational, from consumeristic to missional. There's bad ways to do this, right?
Yep, you bet. Steve, you got thoughts?
Yeah, there is a dual system, I think, because until there's greater traction by the whole, you're coexisting. And the key is to get the buy-in from those that, in a sense, have the ability to make the decision. So that was a key strategy. But yeah, there is internally at leadership level, we used to call it the club versus the kingdom direction. And so we actually had a name for the coexistence system.
Love it, Steve. And I've worked with a couple of church planters, and even if you're planting in that network kind of collaborative style, especially if you're Anglican, you're still working within a hierarchical denominational system, and you get the same sort of clash there that Cotter outlines in that space. Other thoughts, reflections, questions?
I think, Rod, just going off what you said, I think our culture piece that obviously like Bree brought that shift in was a bias towards saying yes to things. Like let's take risks. So holding, your hierarchical kind of structure, they have theirs. But when you're doing that dual, just like, yes, how do we make this happen, rather than here's a code of conduct, here's this training, here, do this, but go, we want this to happen. How do we make it happen? And I think on one of your slides, Bree, at the bottom, it said permission giving. I think that brings the biggest amount of change when it's not, you don't face 101 barriers, but you are free to move. I think, that speaks a lot into the culture and forms incredible leadership.
Yeah. And that was one of the very unique privileges that I think I had. I worked under a leader who pretty much gave me free rein in a full-time position to do it. And that's not that is not the usual experience. David, yes, Agile, Scrum. I have a lot of thoughts about that process. My husband is a leader in Agile methodology for IT, and I talk a lot about that. And I actually just got a woman on the diocese to talk about Agile and Scrums and those sorts of things. We actually do a daily stand-up as a team at GWAC where we're all accountable, including the senior pastor, for what we're doing each day. The Agile process is usually contrasted to a waterfall process that's more about instead of saying, here's my plan and setting my plan and then, building it according to specifications or running it through, Agile is kind of saying, well, what's next, and doing it in short sprints rather than in long sections. And it's funny because I started out the change process at GWAC from a waterfall methodology. I wrote a big paper. I presented it to the board. I said, this is my vision. This is what I think God is calling us to do. And this is exactly how I'm going to do it. And it didn't go anything like that, not even close. So I tried to run it like a waterfall kind of methodology and ended up very much in an Agile Scrum. What's God doing next? What do we need to do here? Yes, use lots of stories in the way that we brought about the change at GWAC. It was really tricky. We had a massive backlash. We made some mistakes around language and vocabulary and didn't realise some of the kickback that the Australian culture would give to language that was coming from England. And so we had a lot of difficulties for the first little while, and stories was pretty much the way that we broke through all of our. So we used the word missional. That wasn't helpful in our church. The word missional communities just was not received well. People Googled it and found things they didn't like. So we changed language to gospel communities. But the way we won most people over was by sharing stories of success with the communities, sharing stories of where they'd served or, people coming to faith. That was probably the real key way. And look, our whole church isn't won over yet. I don't know how many you'd say, Bree, but still only probably, I don't know how many, I wouldn't say, but there was, our last annual report, I think there was 300 people or 250 people in missional communities, but probably only 100 or 150 of those have a connection to our church. So it's probably still sitting just before or just on the tipping point kind of idea. The difference is now that when you say gospel communities, people don't revolt in anger at you. They're like, okay, they're just a part of who we are. They're just another element. So that's okay. Other thoughts, questions?
Bree, in leading change, to what extent are you mindful of the distribution of innovation curve in terms of engaging early adopters to then engage middle majority and so forth? Is that, I think Steve mentioned the caterpillar illustration, leading out with change, allowing people to catch up. Is that something that you have in mind behind these pathways as well?
Look, it's certainly what we did at GWAC. We went with it. We took the innovators, the early adopters. We went under the radar and we planted a pilot missional community without telling anybody about it and without making any big fanfare about it. And I think the first the church heard of it was when it was big enough to be multiplied into 3 different communities. That's when we started talking about it. And so we definitely kept that sort of innovators then reached to the early adopters. We found the early adopters to the middle majority has been the hardest step. So that's where my research project was really focused on. How do you get that middle majority to move in that missional direction? And that's where the practices became a more effective method. Because we were never going for total change, we never really went beyond that process, because the reality was a church our size was never going to completely move in terms of every person being on about their missional agenda.
What we've noticed is over the years, as culture has shifted, there's a shorter time span, I guess, for people to be able to begin to live out the values of missional discipleship culture. It's a shorter period of time because they're immersed in a culture that continually reinforces what it means to live out the life of Jesus from the home.
Habitus, yeah.
So it's just a fascinating thing that we've observed. But you spoke about the importance of the practices getting, to change, bypassing the mind in some ways. It seems to me there's certain spiritual formation principles, the Dallas Willard sort of concepts based in all of that as well. What practices do you personally practice, I guess, in terms of you leading out change as a leader? Are there certain practices that you implement in your life to be an agent of change, to be an adaptive leader? We saw those values, but practices around that?
Lost you. Yes, there are various practices that I've picked up. There's Darren Cronshaw has also written a paper around practices and communal practices and their role in congregational change, which I know I reviewed as part of my master's project, but it was well worth doing. I mean, some of the practices that we've certainly worked on and certainly a part of my life is that kind of prayer walking in neighborhood practices of hospitality. So there's practices of action and there's practices of reflection. And so in my research project, I sought to implement 2 of each. So one was seeking to bless another person every day. One was seeking to eat with someone on a certain regularity. And then 2 were practices of reflection. People are much better about practices of action, and my research project showed that they brought about more positive change than the practices of reflection. So the practices of reflection were around basically around, who did God send me to and how did I demonstrate and proclaim his kingdom, that kind of practices of reflecting on the opportunities that were had in the day. And then the other practice of reflection was basically kind of around the, what's God saying to you? What are you going to do about it? The practice of learning. What did I learn from Jesus today? What was Jesus teaching me today? So I mean, a lot of the Bells practices and the other ones that have been made popular by Mike Frost and all those sorts of guys are much more active practices. And I think that one of the reasons they're more active is because they do certainly shape culture and bring about change more so than some of the more reflective, passive practices.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Bree. Thanks.
David, do you want to speak to what you've posted?
Sure. So I just think I'm reflecting on our circumstance where our strategy and vision and stuff was typical missional discipleship things, and so when you can't do all of the other programmatic stuff, well, then all of the things that you couldn't shut down because people would revolt have been shut down for you. And so you're then free to just pursue the other things.
Yeah.
But if your vision and values are tied to things that have been shut down, then you're facing, well, our vision and values can't work at the moment, so we need to adapt to that. So, particularly if you're on a journey on missional for mission into missional discipleship, then there's actually a great opportunity because the external does all of the hard stuff for you, and they don't blame you for it. You don't have to spend your relational capital, closing things down or ignoring things or whatever. And so then the trick is, how do you make the most of the crisis and the most of the opportunity to really accept, talk about businesses, businesses that couldn't get an online store running for years suddenly get one running in 2 months. Businesses that couldn't do work from home policies in 10 years all of a sudden do it in 2 weeks. So churches that are couldn't do small groups or missional groups or whatever else, suddenly they're the only groups that can meet. So I mean, they may not be expert or may not be trained and all that sort of stuff, but environment forces and compresses the change. And so understanding that dynamic is available to people is really critical, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Before we ended up in stage 4 lockdown, GWAC had been planning to basically change what we were doing to move our live stream to be effectively a series of resources to be used in house churches or small groups. Now, if I'd tried to do that 3 or 4 years ago as part of the change, which I would have loved to do, I probably would have been shot. But in the current environment, that's certainly before us. But I think it outlines too that that where we are, that like each of our adaptive challenges and the change that we're leading through is different because it depends on where we've started, where we currently are, and the vision we're going after. And I think that's really important to get clarity on what is the challenge before us, what is the change that we're seeking to make, because where we are, our vision and values will set that.
Bree?
Yeah.
Or others. I'm not exactly sure what my question is, but just off the back of that, wondering if you could comment or some of the things to be, I guess, mindful of or careful of if we, given the space that we are in and in that kind of that stage 2 for churches and what COVID's thrown us into, and the potential for looking at like reassessing vision and values and trying to lead change in that area specifically during this time?
Are you talking about resetting your vision and values in this time?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Look, I think it's a great time to do it. It depends if you're trying to do a whole congregation project to set that. That's going to be a lot harder to do in this season as opposed to a staff team that makes the decision that actually this is where we're changing. Because I think it's much easier in this season to sharpen our vision and our values. What we've been working to at GWAC is sharpening our map document and where are we actually headed, what are we going after. And that's quite easy to do across Zoom with the 12 of us. But to do a church-wide vision process, which is what we did last year, involving 600 people in a change of vision would have been impossible in the current season. So I guess it kind of depends a little bit on the process and what sort of vision you're going after. Are you going after one that's bought in by the whole church, or are you going after a leadership set kind of vision?
Yeah. What would be the next step for you guys, like having discussed it at that staff or leadership level?
Yeah, so for us, our vision was set last year as part of a whole congregational consultation approach. The process for us has been going through what was set and working out what needs to be set aside. So we talk about what are they, Bree, you might need to help me leverage, let go, and launch. Yep. So what are some of the things that we need to let go of in this season? We just can't go after that. So one of ours was really pushing in the prophetic in our gathered celebrations. Really hard to do across Zoom and live stream, near impossible. So we've let that go as one of our visions for this year. But there are other ones that we can leverage that, yes, okay, so one of our goals was about rebuilding a welcoming process. Well, we can leverage that because we've got a welcoming process, but now we need to expand it into other spaces. So how do we actually start to move that one? And then what are the new things we need to launch because we just need them in this season? So we've kind of had our vision. Our values have been set for a long time. Our vision statement's been set last year, and then we're really working out, well, what are the steps for us to actually work through on it?
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Anyone else got thoughts then they might want to add? Wisdom?
Just something I was thinking of. William Bridges wrote a book called Managing Transitions, and he talks about, I think I referred to this a bit last week, but that the mindfulness of being aware that once a change process begins to head towards the vision, there's invariably what Bridges calls a neutral zone, and that is the now and the not yet, because the vision promises what's ahead, but reality says we're not there, and there's a cost, and there's suffering, and there's loss. And so there's that sense of being able to negotiate the neutral zone to help people get to the promised land, as it were. So I think that's part of the process there.
Yeah, agreed. Other questions, thoughts, wisdom, reflections, Kairoses you want to share with the whole community?
Yeah, so that's a dangerous question, isn't it? Because most of us know the circle, what comes after that. We have to do something, right? There's a danger in reflection, you know. It is, I find it really interesting to reflect on some of the practices that we've been connected to, generally speaking, in terms of the movement connected to the training from what was originally 3DM, but doing the SWOT analysis, for example, the place of that for evaluation. That means we're not just thinking about what opportunities might be or where the threats are, but you know, that we can actually take an honest assessment of you know, where our failures might be actually in terms of managing change. But then also to embark the whole learning community concept of learning from each other that can foster a sense of change where you're stimulated to think outside your own bubble as you interact with others. That I think that that's a really significant part of the learning community process, and that it takes place over time, and it's not looking for rapid change, but it's that revolutionary change at evolutionary pace. And I think there's something really, you know, significant around change management that's encapsulated somewhat in those practices at a communal level. That's significant for us, you know, as churches. It's something that I know for us at Plenty Life to be true, and that is that we wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for other churches going with us on this journey of change to release missional discipleship. It's happened because of being in this space of togetherness, sharing insight, failure, reflection, and prayer for one another. In that's really been the catalyst for change in a major way. So just some reflections, you know, to offer out of my own experience in that.
Just in recent weeks, I've been reading the book Canoeing the Mountain, which is all about adaptive leadership, and so today's subject has been just a reminder of all of that. And I guess the thing, and in my role at the moment, that puts me in discussion groups with Savashami leaders in different locations, and I guess one of the things that and this is so needed for a lot of our places, just going asking the question, you know, what are we doing? It's almost like for some of them they're the deer caught in the headlight and stunned, not knowing what to do, and yet where adaptive leadership comes in is just that helpful process or I guess atmosphere of change that enables them to gather around and hear from people and to realise that they're not on their own on this journey. And so it's some of that culture of permission giving and team, and that, you know, I guess we see that is such an important part of helping the leadership journey at this point of time.
That's good.
I think it's helpful to have that and build that within your organisation, but as Craig was talking about, have that within and between organisations, to have that same community collaborative kind of between churches as much as it is building that culture within, you know, your own organisation and community.
Well, that's good. And that's probably not a bad place to end this on today, because it reinforces what we hope to be the value of these Kairos conversations, that it is an opportunity for us not just to hear from one person about a particular topic of importance, but from a range of people from differing contexts, where we can learn together and together seek an understanding of what God might be saying to us as we pursue missional discipleship culture and lifestyle, just follow Jesus in his mission in this world today. And I'm greatly encouraged, by what people are sharing and the vulnerability that is being demonstrated here, but particularly thankful for you today, Bree. I don't know how others felt, but honestly, I felt that was just top shelf. Just insights, training, and so thankful for your personal practice that I know you do have in place around just devouring books that are helpful for leadership and organisation, all the rest.
It's a problem.
And there's a lot to reflect on. So once again, guys, this is recorded. It'll be there as a resource that people can access. We're not far away from having a resource section in our website that you'll be able to access these videos and other tools and frames and resources in due course. Spread the word as well. If you think others will be encouraged in our gathering together, extend the invitation to them. We want to be open for all to participate. And thank you for joining in with us on this journey. And we'll run again next Thursday at 12:30. And once again, we'll hear a story to illustrate some of the practices that we're committed to. So we'll maintain that rhythm of some training and reflection, followed by story and unpacking what God's saying to us through illustration as well. But thanks heaps, guys, and bless you in your week ahead. Take care.